name's Ruth Allen. To Connecting with Carers in COVID, our second webinar. Today we'll be looking at the principles of good practice in supporting carers who are affected by mental health issues. And this is the second of 3 webinars. Next slide, please. So I'm joined today by my 4 colleagues here, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Some of you may recognise them from the webinar last week. So I said, I'm Ruth Allen, I'm the Chief Executive of the British Association of Social Workers, BASWA. Matthew, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ruth. My name is Matthew McKenzie, experts by experience, but mainly former carer. I've been caring for my mother close to 18 years over in South London. Unfortunately, she had mental health challenges, and the services provided there were by South London and Maudsley. I used to govern there as a carer governor for some years, but then after a while took the opportunity to set up carer forums, not support groups, but forums to engage with mental health services, with the focus of carers like myself, having the empowerment and I suppose in aim of being co-producing in regards to what the mental health services were doing for families and carers. So that's basically my background, is championing carers from a carer angle.
Thank you, Matthew. Antonia.
Hello everyone, my name is Antonia Boama. I am an expert by experience. I also now run a mental health drop-in centre for people suffering from mental health issues and their carers as well. I'm also on the lived experience and carers group panel at the RCN, and I will shortly be joining Southwest London and St George's Mental Health Trust as a crisis support worker.
Thank you, Antonia. So this series of webinars are being co-produced with our experts by experience, but also by Royal College of Nursing and Royal College of Psychiatrists National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health. So I now turn to Kath Gamble from the RCN.
Hello, yes, lovely to join you again. This is the second week and lots to reflect on from last week, and I look forward to being part of this. We are a bit South London centric because I have had the pleasure of working with both Matthew and Antonia in different premises in terms of our work that we do across South London. And I'm looking forward to being part of this and to sharing some of the skills and our understanding of what we've developed over the last few years of working together.
Thanks, Kath. And Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. So hi, I'm Tom, the Director of the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I'm not South London based, so thank you for inviting me back to be part of this webinar. I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the skills. I should say for our regular listeners and viewers, they may notice that we're 1 panelist short this week from last week. So Wendy, who was the other carer that we had involved, is running. She would love to be doing this again today, but she's actually running an event for her local carer support group in the northeast, also quite far from South London today, so that's why she's not with us.
Thanks, Tom. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in the first session, we were really exploring in quite a general way some of the key issues that have been affecting carers, and it was great to have a lot of feed-in from the audience and to hear some of the issues that you wanted covered during these sessions, but just generally to hear what both professionals and carers who were on the line, and I guess other people as well who are interested in this wanted to know about. So this session and the session that we're going to do next week will focus in on some more specific areas. What I would say before I go on is just to draw the attention of the audience to the chat box, which is part of the kind of white panel that you should have on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't have a white panel with chat within it, then look for the little orange box with the white arrow, and if you click it and it points right, it should open up a panel there, and you can type in your questions, your comments, your observations. We'd really like to hear from you. I said that was a really rich source of information last week, hearing about the things that people are most concerned about. So today and next week, we'll focus in on a few more specific areas of practice, of concern. So some aims for today are to present some key principles of good practice in supporting carers and families through these times of COVID. Everybody joining me today on the panel knows a lot about what good practice looks like, knows about the evidence, and also knows about it experientially. So how do we keep some of that good practice going in these very difficult times? And we're just going to focus in on 3 key areas that actually cover a lot of different aspects of carer support. I'll come on to that in a moment. So key principles of good practice, exploring those, how these are affected by the COVID situation, and how professionals and peer supporters and carers and family members themselves can keep these principles in mind in challenging times. And we'll be having some discussion as a panel as we go through about the implications of COVID for some of these areas of good practice. And we're also very keen again to take questions, comments, queries, challenges from the audience to inform further webinars and other work that we're all involved in supporting mental health carers. So again, please do enter some things into the chat box, press send, remember to press send, and then we'll be able to pick that up and we'll have that as a really important source of further information. So next slide, please. In webinar 1, here are just a few of the things that we picked up on, and I'm going to ask the panel as well in case there's anything that they'd like to reflect on from last week. That webinar is on the BASWA website, and it will be on the RCN and RC Psych website as well, so you can watch it through if you weren't in the audience last week. So some of the things that we talked about were basically the situation of lockdown that carers and families are in, and what they're finding most worrying and stressful in that situation. This was before the announcement last weekend of a slight change in the national policy in England, at least, not so much in the other devolved nations. But of course, we are still essentially being advised to stay at home unless we're going out for work. And so in many ways, nothing's particularly changed. So we talked about that, and we were listening really to the experiences of carers and families during lockdown and some of the implications of that for support. We also talked about the fact that lockdown might, for some people, make things a bit easier. It's not always straightforward. But we also talked about the fact that for some people it was much more difficult, and that it's not a level playing field, but how people experience this lockdown situation, depending on circumstance. Things like income, housing, and the types of issues that families are dealing with all make a huge difference. We talked about the variation in service responses, about how some areas of service, some places were providing much more continuity than others, and we heard about some good practice, as well as hearing about some areas where service users and carers were feeling really quite abandoned by services, but other places where services had gone the extra mile to reach out and keep in contact with people. We heard particularly about the fears around people being admitted at this time, about inpatient admissions, and obviously this is related to people being very concerned about COVID infections in hospital settings. And I know there has been some reports of increases in infection and fatalities in psychiatric hospitals as well as in general hospitals, and so those sorts of the truth around that and the reality of that in particular areas was something that came through as well. That's very worrying for carers. And then we talked a lot about what online support can provide, and in fact Wendy, who's not with us today, was talking particularly about how valuable creating new online support forums had become, reaching out to carers. Of course, the key thing there is, do carers have access to computers or smartphones or Wi-Fi, and this won't work for everybody. And so things like telephone support are obviously also very important. But again, that access to online isn't equally distributed. At the same time, it's one way in which people can stay connected, and support, peer support, carer support organisations using that much more creatively came through. The importance of staying connected generally came through, about how one of the things that, while COVID has created a lot of isolation, it's also really brought into focus how important it is that we find ways of staying connected as people with each other in our personal lives, but also how we overcome those barriers of isolation. If we're service providers, if we're professionals, if we're peer supporters, that we're actually reaching out to ensure that people can stay connected. And then we also reflected that some carer support groups and organisations are doing very well and maybe flourishing through this situation, are able to perhaps work closely with professionals to keep providing things in new and creative ways. Others are struggling for funds, and there are also many volunteers in the carer sector may not be able to go out because of their own lockdown, and that is something that's affecting charities and groups across the country. I'm just going to ask the panel now if they've got any other reflections from last week they'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, what I can mention basically in regards to our last session, our last webinar, is that from my viewpoint as engaging with carers, it is so vital that carers are given the opportunity and find avenues in order to connect with each other, especially through this difficult time. Without that, more trauma, stigma, and pain, I reckon, can affect families and carers. It's been such a difficult time, and it really enhances or brings to the fore the situation where carers can be isolated, which we want to all try and avoid. A very difficult scenario for many people out there, especially carers, family carers, put under a lot of strain. And I'm not saying this is not affecting also the mental health professionals or the NHS. Of course, they have pressure as well, but it does spread across the board. And if I pass back to yourself, Ruth.
Thanks, Matthew. Kath, did you want to come in?
It was only really to just highlight the good practice that people shared, and I know there was a number of trusts that were highlighted, and that was something that we hadn't anticipated, but we just wanted to say how much that we appreciate that, and there will be an opportunity perhaps to link up with those trusts and to share that good practice.
Thanks, Kath. Yes, we want to hopefully involve some more people next week, maybe going forward, who knows, and hear more from those areas that are providing some innovations and great services. Antonia.
Yes, I just wanted to talk about how organisations are struggling for funds. My organisation, the Hub for Wellbeing, was funded to provide a drop-in centre, so it was a face-to-face organisation and provision. But now with the lockdown, our members still need that communication. So we have decided, become a bit creative and decide to start an interim telephone befriending service, just to keep that connection with our members who are very isolated, even more so now in the lockdown, and not able to engage with each other in a safe space and a non-judgmental way. So I think it has basically stopped our funding, but it can give you the opportunity to be creative.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you. It's great to hear how innovative and creative people are being, but obviously that takes a lot of effort as well. But it's great to see that happening. Shall we go on to the next slide, please? So the themes we're going to talk about today are themes that many of you, if you are carers, if you're involved with supporting carers and families, will look fairly familiar. What we want to do is think about these and how they're affected by the current situation, and how important they are during this situation, how we keep working to make sure these good practices happen. So you'll see them here. The first is around promoting peer support amongst carers, involvement and co-production during this time. Then we'll have a session on confidentiality and information sharing during this time. And then the third is around communication skills, specifically for carers and families, and thinking about some specific types of communication skills and needs that people might have during this time. So you've got some handouts which you can also find in the white box, the same as where you find the chat, and that might be helpful in case you have any difficulty reading any of the slides. We've just got a couple of slides to share. So I'd like at this point then to turn to Matthew, and if you could go on to the next slide, please, Steph. Matthew's going to introduce the first of these themes around involvement, co-production, and the importance of continuing to support carer peer support. Matthew.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll just take a couple of minutes just to go through each one of these in the list that I've produced. And, you know, I'll let it be known that it's not an exhaustive list. There's more to it than what you see here, but these are the ones that first stuck out in my mind when I was producing this list for today's webinar. So obviously I'm thinking of mental health trust, I'm thinking about mental health services, I suppose mostly inpatient, but it does reach out to the community as well, carers in the community. And what I feel is so vital that mental health trusts and mental health service providers need to take into account, especially GP surgeries as well, is the acknowledgement of the carer experience. I know the situation with COVID-19 has disrupted and changed a lot of services, but these things must be ongoing. There must be acknowledgement of the care experience. This could be going through continued training for staff in regards to identifying carers, so continued training for staff at those trusts, training for GPs to recognise carers. The second bit, checkup, I suppose, would be for families and carers who have loved ones constantly using the services at the time. So when I mentioned acknowledgement of care experiences, this might be for new families and carers who have loved ones who have been triggered by the COVID-19 situation, have become so unwell. They will be initially be taken on the services of the mental health trust, but for the checkup, what we don't want to lose is the ones that are actually using the services already. And for me, when my mother passed away last month, the checkup from the care coordinator, from my mother's consultant, I thought was most important for myself to keep finding ways of coping with a difficult situation which COVID-19 brought up. Next one is obviously the third point, being mindful of confidentiality. Again, COVID-19 has thrown a lot of people into panic. People must change the way they work, but confidentiality, be it for the patient or the family carer, must be heavily looked into as well, be heavily worked on. We can't forget confidentiality does affect the relationship between the family and carer and their loved one. So we can't lose track of that. And that also goes down to continue staff training on that as well. I think probably the most vital of all of these is actually the fourth one, updating families and carers on the changes to services, especially what's happening to the inpatient wards. Because obviously the situation with COVID-19, some wards have unfortunately been locked down, if not all of them. Some of the wards have been sectioned off for the acute trusts, hence COVID-19 patients, families and carers should be told about this. The mental health trusts should let them know. Otherwise, carers don't know what's going on, and it will raise anxiety levels. Also important is continued care and involvement. Obviously, I'm involved in my trust, South London and Maudsley, and a few others. And one thing that has impressed me with South London and Maudsley is they still seek creative ways to engage with service users, experts by experiences, and carers. It's not just Southwest London St George's. We had a recent meeting on BAME development for staff training. Very good. This is something that should still try to be continued. Just because the COVID-19 situation has fund services to change the way they are, it doesn't mean that it could be a reason to not engage with families and carers or service users on co-production or also care involvement. And the last two, sticking to policies, I'm not sure how many of you are aware about Triangle of Care. I'm on the steering group, the National Steering Group for Triangle of Care. We have mental health trusts for our members, and this helps mental health trusts to adhere their policies to be more care focused in some ways. So that way, care families are not getting shut out. They're part of that triangle to communicate with mental health trusts and also the patient service user. But these things should still be worked upon. Again, the COVID-19 does throw a challenge to trusts out across the country. I really do hope mental health trust hasn't lost sight and focus in regards to Triangle of Care, an excellent policy, and I hope it may continue. And the last thing, a couple of seconds on this, is continued care identification. Again, COVID-19 has thrown a challenge to a lot of services, GP practices, even acute trusts. There must be continued care identification and not too much focus, as opposed to keep on contact, on check up on those who are already using those services. There will be new carers, there will be new families. We can't lose focus of that. So if I hand back to Ruth, or if there's any queries or questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Matthew, thank you for covering that. It's a very comprehensive list and very important to think about how these things can be sustained. In some ways, this is an ethical issue, I think, for services. It's about how do you continue to provide things in the spirit that are meaningful, even when services are under such pressure and having to make such changes. How do we not lose sight of what's so important with this? Because, of course, the carers and the families are going to be there throughout all of this, whatever the services are up to. It's the carers and families who are there working with and supporting their loved ones. Is there anything else from the panel you'd like to make any comment on? I think I need a hand up if you want to come in.
No, I'll go to Kath.
Kath, go Kath, go Kath.
I was just reflecting on the value and the point you made, which was really important, Matthew, about harder to reach communities at this time, particularly for Black and ethnic minority communities who will not be necessarily coming forward unless there's an absolute crisis. And I think that's what I'm learning from both you and Antonia about being very creative about finding ways to engage, and how services are really the last place that people will search out support. And if you've got any ideas about that.
That's a very brilliant question that you've raised, Catherine, especially in regards to how COVID-19 is affecting the BAME community, is affecting BAME staff in the NHS, and it's being brought to the attention of the government. Again, hard to reach communities, as you might, as the panel might already know, I have a forum dedicated to BAME families and carers, and that's a platform that I use, which I've had to move online because of the situation. I didn't really want to lose track of the BAME family and carers experience. And that's one platform that I use. I run it once a month in order to have BAME issues, queries, and even compliments in regards to how mental health trusts are seeking to engage with us, with that community. As just today, I'm happy to at least had an update from our trust's equality lead that they're going to attend the one at the end of this month. And I think it's so important that, again, trusts do engage with the BAME community. I've asked the equality lead, what's the situation with the COVID-19 in regards to BAME staff, and engage family and carers about this sort of thing. We just want to work together with with the health services, with not just health services, but with also the council, the local authority. It's not just down to health; it's down to social care. You shouldn't be a mixing situation with them. We need to work together and try and recognise how can we take on these difficult challenges. So, an excellent question from Catherine.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Ruth and Matthew. So it was I guess, as much a reflection as a question, but I was struck, listening to Matthew and also listening to the panelists talking about last week's webinar, that as well as there being kind of a duty and an onus on mental health trusts and mental health services and care services to support carers, there's also such a massive, there's so much that carers and networks of carers can and do give in terms of supporting people, that there's really huge incentive to mental health trusts to do it as well. From that point of view, a wise woman called Ros Davis once said to me that mental health services can either deal with rising demand in two ways. They can either say, right, we need to close in on ourselves and raise our thresholds and only treat the people that reduce the number of people that we support, and find a way of doing that, or we can open up and be open to the community and say that actually even the people that we very regularly support are getting a very small amount of their care and support from mental health professionals, and the vast majority from their family, their carers, and the community they live in, and that actually services would be well advised to utilise that and to nurture that as a working partnership with carers and supporters as much as possible. And I was thinking about the first bullet point that Matthew's got there about the acknowledgement of carer experience, which I think could be read in two ways. So there's one reading of that which is about acknowledging the experience of being a carer, that can be hard and need support, and that's right. But I think there's also an acknowledgement of the experience and skills that carers have got to give and to work mental health trusts. And I think so. I was just reflecting really on the huge potential around that, but actually that now even more, as there is often reduced contact for community patients from mental health trusts at the moment, that it's not even so much about continue to try and support carers. It's probably never been more important to work with carers than it is now. And as I said, they're reflections rather than questions. But I'll leave it to see if anyone on the panel has got any thoughts on that.
Thanks, Tom. I was scribbling things frantically there. It's really interesting, and it was making me think about the important role of social work and social care in supporting families. And I think one of the things that's important to say is that although there have been some changes in policy and emergency legislation to reduce, so that local authorities may not need to fulfil all of their Care Act responsibilities. In fact, there are very few authorities that are doing that. It didn't automatically come in, and in the vast majority of places, social care and social work services and carers assessments and funding through that route remains absolutely in force, and those rights and entitlements haven't changed. What I think is difficult is you've got services that are very busy, but I think it's really important that carers know that sort of support is still an entitlement for them. It's very important that they know that, and that's not gone away in this situation. And also I was thinking about strengths-based approach and how important that is, both for a social work and social care approach and as a health service approach as well, is that we work with individuals and with families to ensure that they can feel that they can use all of their competencies and capabilities and be recognised for all that they do and be supported in that by services. And that's a real, I think, responsibility of professionals to support people's strengths and abilities, not to see the deficits and the problems all the time. Whilst obviously appreciating the emotional difficulty that COVID and practical problems that are there. So yeah, and at that point about it's never been more important that we support carers. And of course, as we come out the other side of this, probably on a very long journey, carers and families, and we would hope that we're supporting the resilience and the strength for people to continue in their caring situations with the people that they love and care about, and can kind of sustain that. So we need to be thinking about how we support people for the long term through this crisis. So thank you. Thanks, Matthew. I'm going to move on then to our second theme. Steph, if you could just go back up to the list first. I'll go up one slide. So we're going to move on to talking about confidentiality and information sharing, which Matthew's touched on, and Catherine and Antonia will be talking a bit more about this in a bit more detail. So Steph, if you could go down 2 slides, please, to the confidentiality and information sharing. That's the one. And this is a detailed, small writing slide, but you have got it in your handouts so that you can read it more easily. I'm going to hand over to Kath now.
Thank you very much. This is a busy slide, so forgive us. This is emerged from a piece of work that was done actually quite a long time ago now by Mike Slade and Vanessa Pinfold, who is now at the McPin Foundation. And they talked about 2 carers about the importance of and what they needed to know and how to share information, because it consistently is an issue for every family member about, and particularly in the moment, practitioners are saying to me, how can I share that somebody has got COVID-19 or they tested positive, and the family is then saying we don't want to know, or vice versa. And this is a process that helps practitioners and also the person with the lived experience to actually come through and decide what the process of exploring whether the patient does or does not want the person to know, and what they're willing to share, and it actually provides a really nice platform to be able to also explain sometimes why it isn't possible to share certain parts of information as opposed to others. And I suppose, Antonia, you and I have been working in Southwest London, St George's. I don't know, it is always an ethical dilemma. I'm sure Matthew will say a bit more about it as well, but I think, what would you respond? I mean, it's always very difficult when say, I don't want my family to know anything, as opposed to when somebody says, well, actually, I need them to know everything, and the family doesn't really want to know that much.
I think it's quite tricky, especially looking from my point of view. I didn't really want my family to know anything, because they just didn't want to know. They didn't accept. They weren't interested in the fact that I had mental health issues. It's just something they weren't willing to engage with. So I didn't really discuss it with them, and even now discussing it with them is quite difficult. I think especially in the Black community, the African Caribbean community, you know, it's very difficult for them to accept that there is a mental health problem, or a family member has a mental health problem, or a friend has a mental health problem, because of the way culturally we are brought up, and the rules, the unwritten rules that exist. So there is also that, you know, the family not wanting to know is a really big problem. Yeah.
And I think the learning that we had from participating and also thinking about how best to do this is really following some sort of framework. And I know when I've worked with some families who found it incredibly difficult when somebody hasn't wanted to know or wanted to share, that this has been this particular decision framework was and is very helpful in finding a way in being able to say, if there's somebody doesn't want to give their consent to or share their personal information, there is a process in which everybody goes through. Because often I think that can be misconstrued by families and vice versa, is that professionals are often seen as people that are withholding information either deliberately or that they are getting in league with their individual. So I think there's sometimes a really important role that everybody has to play, and just thinking about what the concerns are. And you're absolutely right, Antonia. Sometimes there are really important reasons for why you don't want family to know, and or people are on their own and wouldn't want to share those particular things. But I think having, as I said, we're sharing this evening, just so that it starts some thinking about. And I know other trusts and other organisations have different ways of sharing information, and it is a continuum. But everybody, you can either be at one end of the continuum to another. So I'm fully going to want my family to know everything, to the other extreme where we are. You can't tell anybody anything, and it's finding that balance.
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult balance to achieve. As for talking from my point of view, I think, at the beginning, I definitely wouldn't want anyone to know, and I couldn't really talk about my mental health issues to other people because I was afraid of their reaction and being basically ostracized, and so we for the person involved, it is quite a big decision, and I think it's quite difficult. It would have been very difficult in my case to persuade me to give let anybody have any information. But on the other hand, you've got to balance up with that. If something happened to me, people would need to know, my family, friends would need to know that I wasn't well and something had happened, and they probably needed their consent, or just need to know that, they probably want to visit or be in hospital. So it's quite a tricky one. It's really tricky one.
And I think you're absolutely right, and particularly at the moment with COVID, is if you don't, if you're on your own, how do you ask for help once you've established that I don't want my family to know, or vice versa? How do you then ask for help afterwards? And I think that's something that is a big challenge, and how you share. Actually, I don't feel very well, and I need some family and friends now around me, and especially if you feel as though somebody's ostracised you, are very big considerations.
Yes, because sometimes in the end, it eventually has to come out that you've had COVID, whatever, and that there's always that risk that you will still be ostracized. So it's a very, very tricky thing. But I also think perhaps maybe we've got to look at a lot of the BAME people who are unfortunately passing away from COVID-19 and the high numbers, and those with a lot of underlying conditions. So I think in some cases, family, friends will not want to know because they fear for their own lives. So we also have to take that into consideration. And as someone who might have COVID, you have to think long and hard about letting other people know.
Thank you. Any kind of comments from the panel about that? I suppose just to sum up what I think we're saying really in a way is that it's really important that we think through the steps of decision making, the ethics of it, the process. There is a process. I think one of the issues in a pandemic and a crisis situation is the shortcutting of things. So maybe sharing things with family members that that actually shorted, I don't know what the word is, you've bypassed the views of the person to get and are sharing perhaps beyond your usual protocols, and sustaining the steps in that protocol of decision making is really, really important for the sort of integrity of working relationships and to follow the wishes of everybody involved, and to try and get some clarity in what will often be a very muddled situation. So I wonder if anybody else wanted to comment on what Kath and Antonia were talking about there. Tom, Matthew, did you have anything to add? Matthew, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick one. I certainly agree with Kath and Antonia in regards to the challenges information sharing can bring up. It's a fine, very, very fine line between stepping over confidentiality, to be honest. It can easily happen. And it's difficult when someone's very unwell. Obviously, the family and carer can be very concerned. They're doing what's coming out of their hearts. They want to know how their loved one is being treated. So it's a very thin line for NHS staff to hold those relationships in check and hold confidentiality in check. What I'd like to quickly say is that it's understandable if the patient or the loved one doesn't want to divulge information. But what's so important is that there should be a framework, and two, there should be at least a continuing emphasis and work in having the patient and the carer work together as in a triangle. That's the whole point of the triangle of care, that these things just don't break down completely. So there is no communication. So that's my take on this.
Thanks. Tom, did you want to come in?
I have a slightly different question about information sharing. So it's a slight different direction, but I noticed, I think it's come through in a question from someone who's listening as well, but I was thinking about the method of information sharing has changed probably quite drastically over the last 6 weeks, and a lot of communication generally is done through video conferencing and video calls. I think there was a question that came about whether there's any concerns about any of them, and I've certainly had conversations, or people have talked to me who work in mental health services about whether there's or should we be using Teams to do it, or Zoom, or a particular platform. And then another school of thought that the platform should really be the one that that the person that you're talking to, whether it be a carer or a service user, is most comfortable using. So rather than enforcing an organisational one. So I just wondered whether there was any thoughts about the methods and any concerns about video calling. I did look up while you were talking the NHS's advice on this, and they state that it's fine to use, this is the NHS England website about information governance, where they say that it's fine to use video conferencing tools such as Skype, WhatsApp, FaceTime, as well as any other commercial products. The consent of the person you're talking to is implied by them accepting the call and entering the consultation. So the NHS seems to be saying it's fine to use whatever platform you want to use, but I don't know. Yeah, I'll go to Catherine.
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, Kath. Just to say, we've done a lot of work on this in Basel just recently with NHS Digital, actually, and Health Education England. In fact, it's a real join up across health and social care, focused on social workers and digital capabilities, and we've got some ethical considerations that go with that. So the point that you're making there, Tom, is that I think sort of functionally there's ways of making any platform safe enough, as long as somebody's given consent and you've put in some safeguards around, maybe if it's Zoom, is it password protected, or all, you can put those things in. There are some other kind of ethical issues, I think, around whether different types of platforms harvest the data of the people that are using them. So there are sort of different levels, I think, of concern about different platforms. But at the same time, I think that principle that we should be thinking about what our service users or carers are comfortable using should be an organising principle, rather than being totally organised by, I'm professionally nervous about this, it's not been on my list. And also organisations need to give practitioners guidance really that is fit for the times that we've got, which is where we're having to be more flexible. And just one last point which relates to this question that's come in. I think it was Wendy last week who talked about this. In fact, with online platforms and confidentiality, in fact, people can join, particularly if you join without your name showing and without you using your camera. You can actually join a forum online. You don't have to speak, you can listen, or you can speak and not show your face. So in some ways it can actually help with easing people into support environments rather and confidentiality and protecting your privacy, rather than it necessarily exposing things, which I thought was a really nice point. Kath, did you want to come back on this?
Only to say that, you know, remote consultations are now going to become more common. And it is also a challenge. I know I've just been doing some supervision with a team who were challenged by the ask of somebody who was concerned that information about his COVID status had been shared by his partner, and it was, and that just brings out the dilemma that everybody had, in that they felt that they had a need to ensure that everybody was safe. And I know those are all sorts of conversations like that are happening all over the country at the moment about how to share it and the way in which we can do it, especially if we're doing it through remote consultations.
We've had a comment about a particular organisation that has, I think we're hoping will share their good protocols, and a trust in the south of England. And it just made me think about how important it is that we gather up what we know about good protocols around sharing, and hopefully perhaps some particular examples that we could post on our websites, perhaps, where information protocols have been adapted for this extraordinary kind of situation that we're in. And I think that would be a really useful resource if we could host some of those. Thank you. Conscious of time, so we're going to move on to our third theme, and this theme is around communication skills. Steph, if you could just go back up to the slide that's got the themes on it, please. I think that's the one. And again, I think this is Kath, you're going to lead on this, and this is the whole area of how we all help each other really develop our communication skills, and the particular communication skills that can be useful for carers and families, and how COVID is what the implications are for that. So Kath, can I hand over to you?
Sorry, back on the clock here.
Back in the room.
Yes, I think Antonia and I are going to sort of slightly share this, and obviously with all of us are thinking about this. It's one of the most challenging things is when you're living under the same roof. It really came home to me last week around how our communication styles can often exacerbate stressful environments, using, talking about people as though they're not in the room when they are, and so using he and she rather than I for the referring directly to the person is always a bit of a challenge. And that's what I always say to families. The first top 10 tip I would give them is that if you are referring to a person, you use their first name, and also to ensure that they that there is an opportunity to listen. And we've done some skills workshops, and Antonia has referred to the one that she attended at our recovery college, but it was also the point around actually how to overcome stressful environments. If you're constantly arguing, how do we get round it? And that was the point we'd had. And I think, Tom, you talked about a particular scenario which was around as things start to get easier theoretically as the lockdown release slightly, what that might incur for families, and how do you get over arguments? Is that the question? I think the point was.
Yeah, so we were just talking before we came live, and so I think it would be reasonable to say that the advice from the first stage of the relaxing of lockdown this week has been interpreted in different ways, and maybe clarity has not been universal. and that actually, that's even when only very small things have changed. And over the next period of weeks and months, we're going to have more steps to the easing of lockdown and the changing situation. And it just strikes me that that could well cause quite a lot of anxiety. There could be different views about what we may be allowed to do between different people in a house. There might be different anxieties that people have about doing different things, and that could cause quite a lot of conflict particularly if the message is not always crystal clear. So I thought they just fed in quite personally really to the issue of communication and how to manage that kind of stressful situation. So I'm really interested in particularly Antonia and Matthew's kind of thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Tom. I think there's one thing that the message about, I think it's from today actually, that we could go to the park and sit in the park for as long as we want. We could exercise with our family. But I mean, the message wasn't that clear, and I think probably the issues that will be coming up will be that one person thinks, right, the lockdown is over, I can go out and do whatever I want to do. And then you've got a carer, remember, who's really quite fearful and probably doesn't want to go out because, you know, people are still dying out there. And, you know, social distancing is still in place, and not everyone, for someone who regularly goes for a walk in the park, is obeying the social distancing measures. So I think it is going to be, this is going to be a very moot point. But I think the best thing to do is to sit down and talk to each other and listen to each other and listen to what he's saying, what everyone's fears are and everyone's desires are, and what is the, probably try and come up with a common aim or goal, and just agree a set of rules. We have set of rules, so when we're outside, in certain situations, this is what happens, and also agree what happens if you don't. Those, you know, those rules are not obeyed. So I think it's going to be a very tricky time as this lockdown is eased, because people want to be out, they want to be free, and I think it's going to raise a lot of very anxious moments. Yeah.
Are we kind of saying that, I mean, for anybody who's supporting carers, obviously for carers themselves and for people using services, to hear this and to feel that it's better to be talking about these things and creating a space where things can be talked about rather than trying to not to avoid the conversation. But I think it's also a key message for professionals who might be trying to support individuals and families about how they can help create those spaces where conversations can happen about what might feel like a real kind of a detail, but could be really crucial in a family, about how long and how long somebody goes out for and where they go, and whether they're abiding by the you know, the social distancing rules. That could be a really, really important conversation for professionals to try and help families to have during this particular time. I think it's just that it's important, isn't it, that people are really thinking, trying to walk in the shoes of people who are navigating this very messy situation, conflicting advice, and, as you said, people probably wanting to leave the house. Just made me think about that focus for professionals to keep an eye on.
Yes, I was just thinking about how incidents like that can turn us all into naggers, and you're going to nag and eventually get my point across. And I think that there's times like this that there's, from my understanding and the conversations I've had with many families, is the challenge of actually starting to find the likeable again, to try and avoid those positions where you can get in a communication rut. And I worked with a lot of families who say, gosh, they suddenly realise that when you start to think about saying something positive, that in actual fact it's been quite a long time since you've actually been able to do that, and how invaluable it is to practice saying valuable things and just noticing when you really do value the person, in order to be able to think, oh, actually, let's just measure just how many times I say something positive, as well as how many times I actually say something that perhaps would be construed as somebody nagging at you, and, you know, get off my back, I'm just trying to my best, I am going to go out whether you like it or not, is a response that may well sound very familiar to a lot of people on this webinar.
And that's obviously a message for any family anywhere. That kind of, you know, especially in lockdown, there's that sense of intensity and getting stuck into unhealthy relational dynamics, and that's only going to be exacerbated if things have been perhaps tricky for a whole range of reasons before. That's really interesting. I'm just conscious of time, and we've got. I just want to perhaps pay a bit of heed to a couple of other queries that have come through, not necessarily because we've got time to answer all of them, but just to acknowledge them. There is one which I am just trying to find. It's just about how carers can be listened to and actually heard at this time, and particularly be heard to ensure that their loved ones remain safe and out of hospital. I suppose there's something about how professionals listen carefully to what carers are saying as early as possible to try and help support a situation so that things don't escalate. And turn into a situation of, say, an emergency intervention, a mental health act assessment, the risk of an admission. And I guess that's something for all professions, you know, all the health and care professions needing to look out for that. I think that's something that these are the sorts of themes that we can think about for as we're planning for next week as well. And there was also one here I just want to go to, which is about there can be particular issues with Black and African Caribbean men about discussing their health, physical or mental health, and maybe about any ideas panels have about how carers can, any outlets for carers to go to get perhaps information around that. I'm not going to suggest we try to answer it right now, but I think it's something we can carry forward. I think there's something there about the kinds of information that both the person themselves and their carer or family might find useful. Source, you know, ways of we're all different, and different parts of all of our communities will feel more comfortable talking to some people than others, and going to some outlet, you know, some sources of support than others, and we need to be paying attention to that. And as whether it's professionals or peer supporters, having information for people about that. So just to acknowledge that, we'll acknowledge all of those queries that have come through. We've got just a couple of minutes to go, and I'm just going to go to the panel and just say, is there any, you've got like 20 seconds, is there anything anybody would like to add to sort of sum up, or just something a burning point you've been wanting to make before we close this webinar? Matthew.
Be very brief. I'd say to families and carers who are, you know, struggling through the COVID situation, you know, please, you know, find the time to engage with your trust. If they're not responding to yourself and your loved one, the trust should implement, like, you know, should be at least have a number or comms, email, or PALS, you know, patient advice liaison service. Certainly, please use any one of those to find out what the trust is doing for your loved one and for yourself as well. So that's my sum up.
Thank you, Matthew. Anybody else like to come in?
There's somebody, it's because you two are here, Antonia and Matthew, there's somebody been asking about whether there's any particular places that you may well recommend for Black and ethnic minority media outlets, and where carers might go. And perhaps we can add that to the information, but just off the top of your head, is there anywhere you'd recommend?
It's different in each area of the country, to be honest. It really depends on the diversity of the area or the borough you're in. I know at the moment Black Thrive is trying to push the agenda, but it's really at the moment it's certain sporadic in different areas of the country. But it's something we can always add at a later date.
We'll add some resources around that, Kath. I think that would be really important. Antonia, Tom, you've got less than 20 seconds. Well, can I just thank you all? Can I thank you? Thank you, Matthew, Tom, Catherine, Antonia, for joining me. Thank you, everybody who's joined online. This webinar will be posted, as I said earlier, so you'll be able to watch it. Please share that with anybody you think would be interested. And we will be talking on different topics, but all related to connecting carers during COVID at the same time next week on the 20th. So do join us then. Thank you very much.